Someone, I think. Here we go.
Thanks very much indeed, Chris. So yeah, this is the first seminar of the new term for the Oxford Energy Network. I'm Robin Morris, convener of that network. We're always really pleased to be able to get together at least once a year if possible with the MSc students and find a topical and interesting topic. And we've got this evening Jim Watson. Just thinking of the talk title, which is Energy Policy at the Time of Multiple Crises, is the UK government getting it right? I'm hoping that you're going past a two-letter answer to that this evening. So Jim is Professor of Energy Policy at UCL, and I know probably Jim better from his time when he was leading the UK Energy Research Centre, which seems a long time ago now, but I guess it was three years. Yeah, look what happens in that time. Jim is also Director of the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources and Research Director for the FCDO, Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office Climate Compatible Growth Programme. And he still manages to retain an associate relationship with SPRU at Sussex as well. And is it really only 20 years of research experience you have these days?
Probably not depending on younger than I am. Yeah.
But the key thing is, Jim also advises a number of government committees, including Environmental Audit Committee, Lord Select Committee, and so forth. So I'm hoping that those ears are open to advice that Jim has to offer, so we can share in that this evening. So I think over to you, Jim. Look forward to hearing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin and Chris, for the kind introduction and the invitation. I hope you can hear me all right at the back. Yeah, great. We've got thumbs up in the back. Robin, you've anticipated my first sentence, which is to give the answer to the question. So those of you who are really time poor, the short answer is no. But I hope you will stay for a little longer to find out why, in what way, and what perhaps needs to be done to fill some of the gaps and to rectify some of the problems with the UK government response. I know in the MSc you've got quite an international group, so I hope this tale of the UK is interesting for you. I think it's a good case study because all countries have been grappling with the impact of the energy crisis and climate change and so on in different ways. And I guess this is a case study in how a government tries to balance multiple policy objectives, because energy policy isn't about one thing. It's not just about reducing emissions. It's about security. It's about affordability. Clearly, at the moment, that's a massive agenda. And in most countries, it's also about creating jobs from the energy industry or through new technology. So even though this is a UK case study, I think it has lots of resonance for other countries in the way that they are grappling with the same pressures, perhaps in some cases more successfully, but I'll let you be the judge of that. So what I'm going to do is a bit of background about the UK sort of energy transition. We're already on a transition like most countries for a number of reasons. A little bit about the crises and how they're manifesting themselves. This is, I'm sure, material that some of you have seen before, but just to recap on it. What is it that the UK government has done in terms of responding to the crises, both over the last few years, but particularly over the last year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then finally answering the exam question: in what way aren't they getting it right, and what else should they be doing? So the transition so far, I've got a lot of data and graphs. I've not got that many words on my slides because I thought being early evening, that might be a good way to approach this. And hopefully you're okay with graphs, because I've got lots of them. So this is really the UK energy system and where energy consumption is coming from across the different fuel sources. Like many countries, we are dominated by fossil fuels. Of course, like many other countries, we've started our journey away from fossil fuels. But at the moment, as this graph shows on the right-hand side, 2021, we're an 80% fossil fuel energy system. That's mainly gas and oil now. The coal that built the British modern economy is just about disappeared, as you can see on the bottom there. The share of low carbon energy is starting to increase, but you can't see it as well on this graph as you can on the electricity graph, which I'll show you in a moment. But it's now about 20% of energy demand is from low carbon energy. The other thing that people don't often know about the UK, and it's shared by some other industrialised economies, is that we've peaked our energy demand. The highest point of energy demand was in around 2000. And it's been going up and down since, but the trajectory overall is falling, partly due to efficiency and partly due to the economic restructuring we've continued to do. So less manufacturing, more services, that kind of thing. Electricity is where the really rapid changes happen. You can see that with this chart. So we got to now around 60% of low carbon generation last year. So that's some fresh data from the electricity system operator, National Grid. Roughly speaking, that's including nuclear, it's including renewables, and those renewables include bioenergy. And bioenergy, of course, is controversial. In some cases, it could be regarded as renewable. In others, there's some question marks about its real carbon footprint. But I've included everything in that. But certainly over 50% of our power is now coming from low carbon sources. The vast majority of the rest is gas. And that has really big implications when we come on to talk about energy security and prices later. Emissions, we're about 50% of the way there to our target of net zero, which sounds great. So a 47% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. We've got another 30 years to go to 2050. So it sounds like everything's going well. I'll obviously explain later that perhaps that's a little bit simplistic, but certainly so far, those shifts in electricity, those shifts in the economy have contributed to that fall in emissions. And this is just a bit of detailed data from the Committee on Climate Change. That's the government's set up an independent advisory body to scrutinise emissions reductions, to advise on how fast we should do them. And you can see there, so the black lines on the left-hand side of each graph is showing you the history. The sort of, I don't know what colour you call that, brownish line on the right-hand side is where the committee thinks we need to go. And you can see on that electricity is really where those big emissions reductions have happened historically so far. Some quite big reductions in manufacturing, so that's the economic restructuring I mentioned, and a little bit of progress in areas like buildings. Surface transport is pretty similar apart from the drop in the pandemic. And of course, aviation, you can see a big drop in the pandemic because nobody was flying anywhere. But that is now starting to recover. So it just gives you an idea of where those emission savings are coming from. So that's just a bit of background data. So now on to the multiple crises that I've got in the title. First, climate change. Climate change is not only still with us, it's getting worse over this period and really coinciding with, of course, the energy security and price crisis we've experienced over the last year or two. And these are just two pictures from last year about the climate impacts that have been suffered. Clearly, we've had climate impacts before, but I think what last year indicated is that they're perhaps getting more frequent and more intense. So on the left-hand side, the floods in Pakistan, which really affected agriculture, affected a lot of the land there, with very, very big implications for communities, for farming, for a lot of other areas of their economy. And on the right-hand side, just one of many graphics you can find about the impact of the heat wave last summer in July, where certainly in the UK and many other countries, we had record temperatures. And that's just, you can tell it's an American graph from the New York Times because they're using Fahrenheit rather than centigrade, but certainly well above average, which is really indicated by the red areas on that chart there. So that's just two of the example manifestations. I could talk about a very, very bad wildfire season in North America as well, many other things. So of course, if climate change is with us, it's getting more pronounced. And even before that happened, links were being made between climate change and security, and even energy security. So this is a quote from the UK Minister of Defence. Often defence departments, including the UK one, the American one, are some of the places where you see some more far-sighted thinking. You wouldn't have thought so, but actually part of their job is to think about risks and threats to society over a long period of time. And they've highlighted back in 2018 that the impact of climate change on economies, on trade, on the way we operate our lives, potentially could be really, really large. And we're now starting to see some of this manifest itself. So that I put that slide in really to make the link to the next crisis, which is, of course, energy prices and security. The two are very much linked. So if you look at most definitions of energy security, they will emphasize that security means not only access to energy in a reliable way, but actually at a price which is affordable. They bring the two things together. And of course, in some cases, the UK being a good example, we've seen disruption in the form of a price increase. We haven't actually had much in the way of physical disruption to our energy supplies. People individually in some homes have limited the amount of energy they use because it's become unaffordable. And that's obviously a very widespread phenomenon. So I've got a couple of charts of what's happened to prices of oil and to gas, because those are the ones that have really gone up very steeply through 2020 and beyond. In both cases, and certainly in oil, that followed some pretty record lows. So in 2020, because of the pandemic, particularly in North America, you actually saw negative prices for a while. So that was people trying to get rid of oil, but they weren't charging for it, they were paying people to take it away. But then very rapidly, as economies recovered, changed into a very steep rise. The point I want to make with this graph and the gas graph that follows is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine about just under a year ago wasn't the event that triggered these steep price rises. Actually, they were already rising very, very fast because of economic recovery from the pandemic, and the invasion actually increased and exacerbated that price rise, certainly for gas in quite a big way. So we saw very high oil prices. They've started to now pull back a bit. This is partly China's zero COVID policy. So what China is doing with its economy has had quite a big impact because it's such a big player, such a big consumer of oil, consumer of energy generally. Gas is a similar story. I've put two charts in. One gives you a slightly longer term view on the left, and then the shorter term view, which is it's quite important to bear in mind on the right hand side. So firstly, the longer term view, which goes to August last year. And you can see these real series of very steep rises and falls back, and eventually going to these increasingly setting records for the spot price of gas, particularly in Europe. But same sort of pattern happened in the Far East, to a lesser extent in the United States. United States gas prices are decoupled to some extent from other gas prices because they produce a lot of shale gas. Their prices have stayed a lot lower. But again, these price spikes started to happen well before the invasion of Ukraine because of recovery from COVID. Then Russia started restricting supplies to Europe, and then the invasion happened. So you've got progressive ratcheting up of that pressure. What's happened more recently, particularly in the last couple of months, is that the warm winter, on average, you wouldn't believe it today, but the warm winter we've been having in many countries has actually led to a reduction in prices. So storage of gas in many European countries is still quite good. It hasn't been used as anticipated. So there's more gas around, and hence short-term prices are falling. So the picture is shifting again over the last few months. This is the picture on bills. I'll come back to this a little bit later on, but energy bills in the UK, just to give you a sense, for those of you who haven't followed it, or I'm sure most of you have, because most of you will be paying energy bills. But just this is a really good piece of research from the House of Commons Library. I found lots and lots of brilliant briefings from the House of Commons Library. This one's only just come out, and it just shows in context where the price cap we've got at the moment, where an average household is paying about £2,500 a year, fits in context. So for many years, you can see this going back to 2019, but if you went back further, it's pretty similar. The average home was paying something around £1,000 a year across electricity and gas. Now it's 2.5 times that, but with an extra payment, as it shows there in summer 2022, of £400 that most of you should have received as a series of rebates from your supplier. Come the spring, so about April onwards this year, that cap is now going to move up to £3,000. Now, of course, if you're a particularly high consumer, you're going to be paying more than that. This is just an average. So clearly this is very serious. It's a very big increase to a tripling of what it used to be, and it's pushed a lot more households into fuel poverty, in millions more homes struggling to pay bills and therefore limiting the amount they use effectively. So that impact is the biggest impact, not just the UK, but many other countries too. I'll come on later on to talk about the way in which governments responded and explaining some of the subsidies and price caps that have been put in place. That's common across many, many countries. So the level of consumer subsidies in industrialized countries is unprecedented at the moment. You know, Germany spending, I think, 200 billion euros. I think you add up the numbers for the UK, it's in the tens of billions of pounds the government is spending over this financial year and next financial year. I'll give you some numbers of it later. So first on the policy responses, what have government actually done in response to these crises? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's worth just bearing in mind that policy responses didn't start last April when the UK government published an energy security strategy that built on top of a whole series of policy responses through successive governments. So they've sat on top of each other, and that's quite normal in areas of policy like energy. You don't start with a blank sheet of paper, you build on what was there already. So something that's important, still in place, and drives a lot of policy still is the Climate Change Act. So that's what limits the amount of emissions the UK emits every 5 years, but also has been amended to put in place our net zero targets. Many countries around the world now have net zero targets, some for 2050, some for earlier or later dates. And we have this Committee on Climate Change I mentioned earlier to oversee that process. I'm going to use some of their charts as I go through. I think two things have happened since then to energy policy, because for a time, and when the Act was passed, I think climate and emissions reduction was the really important emphasis of energy policy. That was the thing governments focused on most above everything else. Partly because energy prices were relatively low compared to now, and partly because they didn't have to worry about energy security as much. So one thing that happened is since then, the UK has rediscovered what we call industrial strategy, the idea that government might direct the shape of the economy and link that to areas like low carbon. So we think about creating jobs. So there's been a lot of strategies from government that try to link job creation to emissions reduction. The latest one from a government advisor came out last Friday, Chris Skidmore, who's a member of Parliament, who was asked to look at how do we meet this target in a more business-friendly way and maximise the economic opportunities of doing so. The second thing that's happened, of course, is the response to the pandemic. The pandemic and the energy price crisis. So we'll come on to that as well. And since the Climate Change Act, of course, we've put in law our net zero target as well. So this is just an example from the last Prime Minister but one. We've been going through a lot of Prime Ministers, as you probably all know over the last 12 months. But I guess something that was particularly associated with Boris Johnson, like him or loathe him, was this idea of levelling up and this idea of jobs associated with the shift to low carbon. And this is just a typical quote. There's obviously a lot of debate about whether the words are matched by action, or whether this is just what's called performative policy, somebody saying something to sound good with actually not a lot of substance to follow. In some cases, there is a bit of substance. It's not entirely vacuous, but certainly he was very fond of this particular rhetoric. But then, of course, in early last year, just under a year ago, lots and lots of responses to the invasion of Ukraine. And they were quite quick. So you got responses in early March from the International Energy Agency advising countries on oil and gas, how to respond, how to reduce demand quickly, all sorts of behavioural measures suggested, particularly on oil fronts, such as car sharing, a limited amount of driving more slowly. Really interesting how some of these ideas, which might seem quite radical to many people, suddenly became mainstream. Not, I hasten to add, in the UK. It certainly the IEA did. The European Commission came out with its Repower EU plan in May. It took them a little while to agree that, because of course that has to be agreed by all member states. I'll compare that to the UK plan in a moment. And then the British Energy Security Strategy, as it's called, came out in April. So lots and lots of responses to that invasion of Ukraine. That was then followed by the current Prime Minister. This is when he was campaigning the first time around, rather than the second time around, when he lost and then he won later, for those of you who follow these things. But very striking thing he said is he wants to make the UK energy independent by 2045. That's a very new thing for UK politics. It's not really something that any politician of any party has ever committed themselves to before. If you're an American and you live in the US, this is very familiar. So American presidents or candidates for president since Richard Nixon, who is famous for other things, of course, have committed to US energy independence. So Nixon made a speech in 1974 committing the US to energy independence, but that only happened under Donald Trump. So the US took a long, long time before the amount of energy they used and exported was matched by the energy they imported. Doesn't mean to say they cut themselves off from the world, but it meant that they had a balance between imports and exports. And that's, I think, what Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, wants to achieve here. It's a pretty tough thing to get to. So what did the government say in this energy security strategy? These are just some key points I picked out. So first thing, and this is really normal, the government brings out a new strategy, and actually a lot of it is a reheated version of the old strategy, and that was the case with this one. So the 10-point plan I showed you earlier on with that quote from Boris Johnson, a lot of those targets about increasing renewable energy, increasing nuclear energy, etc., were in there. Phasing out Russian coal and oil by the end of 2022. I'll show you some charts in a minute that at least indicate that they may have achieved this. Modest reductions in energy bills at the time. There was some help for households, not as much as I showed you on that chart earlier. Controversially, new licensing for new oil and gas in the North Sea was announced, and there have now been another licensing round for new developments. I'll comment on that in a moment too. Long-term plans, as I said, for low carbon energy. Very little on energy demand, energy efficiency. I mean, there's a section on it, but I thought it was I could be extremely rude about it, but it didn't really have much new in it. Basically, I'll put it that way. The other thing is energy for transport. It was almost wholly absent. I mean, the transport sector uses a large chunk of our energy. It constitutes a massive chunk of our emissions, and yet there was no talk at all about oil supply for transport. For all we want to move to alternatives, clearly most vehicles still use oil products right now and will do for the next few years, if not decade or two. And there was nothing in there about security, which is really, really curious because that's where security started in the 70s. It was all about oil. So it's interesting that that wasn't part of the picture at all. So I'm going to talk a bit about the fossil fuel aspects a little bit more. So I mentioned Rishi Sunak's energy independence point here, and you can see with this graph just how far away we are. So this shows the ups and downs of the UK in terms of our balance between imports and exports. So basically when the graph goes below the line, we're a net exporter, and we have been for a while. And when it goes above the line, we're a net importer, which is where we've been for the last 20 years. So we're dependent on imports quite a bit for oil. I've listed the top 3 countries we get oil from. So that's Norway, USA, Libya, and the top 3 for gas. So more than half of our gas is imported. Norway, Qatar, US. Notice the word Russia doesn't appear at all on this chart, but it doesn't mean to say that when Russia does something, that doesn't affect it because it affects the price. Demonstrated. One thing governments announced recently is a big deal with the US to increase imports of US natural gas, at least doubling, if not more, over the next few years. So that's one thing they're doing. I've now returned to my friend, the House of Commons Library team, who are heroes as far as I'm concerned, because they keep putting out this great data, which shows us what's happening much earlier than anyone else. So they've got some really good data on what's happening to our imports of oil and gas from Russia. And you can see here that historically we've imported a fair bit. But actually, since sometime last year, slightly different in each case, we've almost stopped importing gas. It was only 4% of our demand was gas, so that was a bit easier, mainly by tanker. Oil was about 9% of our demand, and that seems to almost stop. So we've, at least if you believe this data and it carries on, we've met those targets in the energy security strategy. Clearly, lots of other countries are doing that as well, and so therefore they're all trying to source oil and gas from somewhere else. And that's one of the things that's really pushed up, particularly gas prices. And this is just an explanation, I won't go into great detail, of why Russia matters so much, especially as you go further to the east in Europe. So the first chart, there's a lot of these maps around on the internet. It shows all the pipelines basically coming from Russia, many of them through Ukraine. So this is one of the roots of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as well as, of course, other factors. Some of them bypass through Ukraine because Russia and Europe have wanted to do that to get more diversity of sources and routes. You can see all these red lines coming through. And then the data from the Financial Times on the right-hand side, I think the thing to look at, is the pink lines here. So you can see the further east you go in Europe, the more countries tend to be dependent on Russia for their gas. So the more challenging it is to try and move away from Russian gas. So for countries like the UK and Ireland, it actually doesn't figure on their chart. It's much easier. Whereas if you're, in Slovakia or Austria or many of those other countries, it's a very tall order to entirely move away from Russian gas. I mean, some countries have been 100% dependent on Russian gas. So there's a bigger challenge there. So investing in UK oil and gas production is something the government said it would do, and as I said, there's been a new licensing round. And you might think from the way the government talks about it, that this is something that can make a massive difference to the way in which we get oil and gas. More UK production can really help to shift that graph I showed you just a couple of slides ago, so that we become closer to imbalance between imports and exports. The bad news for government, and the industry is very clear about this, when I was advising our parliamentary committee until the end of last year, they've reported now on this very topic. And they would say, look, the UK is a mature basin. It's declining quite quickly in terms of the amount of oil and gas it produces. If you license more fields, it might decline a bit more slowly, but it's not going to turn itself around and become a bigger oil and gas producer overnight. So these charts, and they're from a committee on climate change, basically the yellow graph here, and this is for oil, kind of shows what's happening in terms of production, and then there's a projection from the regulator, the Oil and Gas Authority, that's what OGA means on the slide, about what will happen between now and 2050. They've included in that with some new fields and some new licensing, so it's not just running down the fields we have. Then the Committee on Climate Change has put over the top where demand needs to go in order to meet our climate targets and budgets over time and meet net zero. So in this case, there's a sort of happy coincidence that the amount the UK produces never blows our carbon budget. So the industry can claim that all their activities are compatible with net zero. You'll hear that said. You'll hear it said by the current climate minister, Graham Stewart. He said it to the committee on record. He was very combative on this point. He got newspaper headlines for doing so. But this is what they said. Now, of course, you can ask questions about compatibility with global meeting of Paris Agreement and whether this is really something that an industrialized country ought to be doing, showing climate leadership. But on the strict interpretation, you can look at this chart and say, well, it's okay, as long as that yellow line doesn't go above the purple line. Similarly on gas, the gas is a bit more complicated. So there's two purple lines, as you can see. So the one that's got slightly longer dashes is the gas trajectory, but that's including carbon capture and storage for some of our gas use. So in other words, you're capturing emissions from gas use and storing them. If for some reason that is not possible, so that's the dotted line which goes right down there, then we really have to bring gas demand around much more quickly. We can't use as much. And actually, once you get to about 2045, we might be producing too much in order to live within our carbon budget. So that gets a bit more tricky for the industry. The industry version of this does include the little dotted one. So you can find that on the website of the industry regulator. So, you know, that's an important message to bear in mind. Something else. So, of course, I've been talking a lot about the present and the future, but I can never resist including my Winston Churchill slide whenever I talk about energy security. So this quote, as you noticed, is about 110 years old. But I think it's not the entire strategy government needs to follow, but I think it's a really important element of any good energy security strategy. So when Winston Churchill, this is before he became a wartime prime minister in the Second World War, he was responsible for the British Navy in the First World War, and he oversaw the shift of the Navy away from using coal to oil for the ships. At the time, the UK didn't have its own oil resources, so he had to basically procure those from abroad. And a lesson he learned rather quickly, was that actually relying on one place for a resource, whether it's oil, gas, coal, materials for wind turbines or whatever, is not a good idea, especially if it's coming via one supply route to your country. So that's something that, of course, is uppermost in the mind of a country like Latvia, where it's reliant on Russia for 100% of its gas via probably a small number of supply routes. So that is something which I don't think has been brought out enough in the energy security strategy, but it's important for oil and gas and also for some of the new technologies too. I said I would return to this chart here to give you some numbers. Brenda, I was telling you about these earlier. So there's a lot to digest. I know I put a lot of words on the slide, but I thought it was actually important to get a comprehensive picture. Partly because we've been through two or three prime ministers. There's been more than one economic plan, about how the government is going to help households. So first, the growth plan. So that was the very short-lived Prime Minister Liz Truss brought out that. That was what crashed the economy and caused all the problems last September. So it didn't last very long. But at the time, there was that cap on average bills of £2,500. So that has survived. An estimate that that was going to cost £31 billion over 6 months. So a very large cost, only over half a financial year. 6 month support for business, an extra £29 billion. So £60 billion was going to be spent over 6 months helping homes and businesses. And then a windfall tax on oil and gas, like many countries that has been implemented in the UK, was going to bring in about 28 billion, but over 4 years. So you can see there's a bit of a mismatch, which is one of the sources of the problems the UK economy had. The sums didn't add up, and basically lots of government borrowing was needed to do this. Now, of course, government didn't have much of a choice to help homes and businesses, but I think the handling of it clearly wasn't very good. The autumn statement of 2022, so that was when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, trying to steady the ship, trying to be more sensible. And the interesting thing, that cap on household bills stayed, and then it's going to be revised from April to £3,000. The interesting thing is the estimate of the cost in this financial year fell, and that's partly because of this fall in gas prices. So instead of 31 billion, it's 25, still a lot of money, and then really falling to 13 billion next financial year. That's for a whole year. So you can see the shift of the cap from £2,500 to 3,000 saves government a huge amount of money. It's still a lot for them to spend. Business support, it did fall as well. Perhaps some better number crunching was done, so that fell to 18 billion. So you add those numbers together, you're still in the tens of billions this financial year and future financial years. Higher windfall tax, 42 billion, so that was increased, the rate of the windfall tax, and it's been extended over a longer period of time. Some more tax breaks for the industry. So one thing I found when looking at the real detail of this stuff was that if you invest in a wind turbine to make electricity to power an oil and gas platform, you basically get 104% of the cost of doing that back against your tax bill. So as long as you're paying tax as an oil and gas company, you're being paid to do that sort of investment. You're not being paid to just put up wind turbines to generate electricity, by the way. So there's a real mismatch in terms of tax treatment between oil and gas and other things, and an electricity generator levy. So I suppose the thing to say about the recent version is that A, the costs have come down a bit, and B, that the amount of revenue government's generating from new taxes has gone up. The votes still aren't balancing, but at least there's more money coming in. And of course, calls for some of that wind tax to be used to fix the problem through energy efficiency programs. Because of time, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I've left this in, and please do have a look at the slides afterwards. I'm very happy to have them circulated. But just to compare the UK response against the European response here. So lots of similar elements, you know, on the low carbon energy front, for example, in the middle there. A real difference in terms of fossil fuel development. The UK is really emphasising that at the European Union level. It's all about diversification and reducing use rather than producing more. Because, of course, not that many European Union members are big oil and gas producers. The big oil and gas producers are outside the EU, Norway and the UK. Energy efficiency, I think, is more ambitious at the EU level to the UK. And then there's a number of other changes there as well. So just as a quick comparison there. So, final part is government getting its priorities right? So I've told you the answer. So it's no surprise, but you know, I suppose I now want to add a little bit of detail. You know, why is it no? And I've started to answer that, but in what way ought the gaps to be filled? So I'm going to start again with the Committee on Climate Change. This is its latest progress report from July this year. What they tend to do now, which is really interesting, and as well as saying, well, this is how you meet your targets, here's a combination of technologies for transport or for power, they will now assess policies and how well developed and well implemented policies are across the board. So this is the emissions picture across the board to 2035, which is when the 5-year carbon budgets end at the moment. The bottom line, the black sort of line, is where the emissions trajectory needs to be. The dotted line at the top is a kind of business as usual line if government wasn't doing anything particular in addition to what they're doing now. And then the colours denote basically levels of confidence in policies. So all the green ones, it's a fairly high confidence. You know, the government's announced it, it's got some plans, they're pretty good, and they're being implemented. There's a wedge of yellow where there's some doubts about the implementation, orange, more doubts about the whole principle, and then red, just an absence of policy. So it's really interesting that they do this. So clearly for some things it's pretty good, but there's a lot of yellow, orange and red. So there's a lot of emissions reductions which need to happen where policies either are partly or fully either absent or not well developed or implemented. And then they do this for individual sectors as well. I've included the key on this one so you can see the sort of language they use, some credible plans to insufficient plans. So transport, electricity, there's more green on the chart. Once you get to buildings, manufacturing, etc., there's more yellow, orange and red. So it gives you some pretty good clues as to where the committee think, and I tend to agree with their analysis where the gaps are. I think another thing that the government has tried to engage with at times, but probably hasn't done enough of it, and there's a really good recent example of this, is really engage with citizens and people in lots of different ways. The example recently has been about this idea of an information campaign, which should have been a no-brainer part of the energy security strategy to help people understand what they can do more quickly to reduce their energy use, turning down boiler flow temperatures, insulating really easy things, turn down thermostats, the usual things. There's now been great government videos and an information campaign out there, but as you might have followed, certainly the Liz Truss government was absolutely opposed to it. They're very libertarian. They said, we're not going to do this. A new government has now said we are. But going beyond that, I mean, the Citizens' Assembly I showed here, which I was involved in now 3 years ago, just before the pandemic and during it, was a good example of a more deliberative and more involved process of engaging the public. Not just telling them what to do and giving them advice, but actually asking them how they think we ought to meet the targets. What should the priorities be? What are the things they're worried about, whether it's technology readiness or costs or how much people should pay? So we did that in the UK, commissioned by Parliament. The French presidency on the right-hand side is another example, commissioned an assembly in France. But I feel there's not been enough as much of that now from to really respond not just to climate and emissions reductions, but energy security too. So I think more of that is required. A number of sectors where more is required, but actually government's starting to do the right thing. As I showed from the Committee on Climate Change Assessment, electricity is one of the areas where government is doing more and is nearer to being on track. We've been working in my institute through a team led by Michael Grubb on a crucial area, or a very technical area, but a really important area of electricity market reform. So basically the exam question here, or the problem is, and it's a problem for the UK, it's a problem for many other industrialized countries that use gas somewhere in the power system, is that because gas prices have gone up and power systems use gas like they do here, gas sets the price, gas generation sets the price of electricity most of the time. So electricity prices are very high, even though more and more of our power is being generated by cheap renewables, whether it be solar or wind or other technologies. So there's a real mismatch between the price people are paying in their bill and the cost of generating these renewables, which are cheap. We're not getting access to that cost. So this whole market reform agenda is trying to say, well, how can we reorganize our market so that we're connecting the cheaper renewables to customers, whether they be industries or households? And so my colleagues have been working on how you might do that in detail. That's going to take 3 or 4 years. One of the good things government has been working on very recently, in the last year or so, is a whole programme of doing this, deciding on options and implementing. But it's going to take a while to do that. I think the other thing where there's question marks, although the current version of the UK government is being a bit more supportive of some of the cheaper low carbon technologies, which is wind and solar, there's still ambiguities and question marks over things like planning. Because the current government's been through several changes of mind on this. So for investors, as the report on Friday said, this is very, very difficult. You can have a government at one time saying, yeah, we want loads of this stuff. And then the next government says, no, sorry, planning is really difficult. We're going to make it as hard as possible to build anything. So there's still a very important lack of certainty for solar and wind. Government's been very, very much more, I guess, supportive on things like nuclear, hydrogen, which of course is an energy carrier. But nuclear is going to take some time to come through, and there are still questions about the costs, but they're particularly enthusiastic about that process. And that's survived several prime ministers. So people who work here will not be surprised by this particular chart and the conclusion we draw from it. This is about energy efficiency in homes. This is something the committee I advised were very, very strong on. They took a lot of evidence about it, and they basically came out and say that we need, in their words, some sort of war effort to really get energy efficiency of homes upgraded and, of course, shift to low carbon heating and so on. We're not doing it quickly enough, partly due to this graph, which some of you might have seen before, which shows the amount of energy efficiency installations we had historically until the early 2010s, about 10 years ago. And then policy was changed. Basically, it was very ineffective, so the amount of installations, the rate of progress really dropped off very quickly, and we've been doing less and less ever since. So we now still have 59% of homes in England that are Band D or below, so Band A is the best. D is not brilliant. Government wants them all to be C or above by the middle of the next decade. There is a bit of extra money on the table. Government's announced about £1 billion a year for low-income homes, and I think that's good to target it for them, but certainly we need more of that. They did announce even more money, and I got rather excited when they did, and then realised that new money was only coming through in 2025. So they said, we're doubling spending, and then the small print said 2025 on. So that's in the next Parliament. We might have a completely different government. We now have a target for reducing demand, which I thought I'd never seen any government announce. 15% for buildings and industry by 2030, and some poor task force is going to be asked to advise government how to do that. So that's good. There's a bit more emphasis on demand than there was last April. So that's I'll give them a bit of credit for that, but more needs to be done clearly. On heating, a familiar story. You know, we're doing a bit on low carbon heating, but the number of installations of things like heat pumps, trials of hydrogen, if you believe in that kind of thing, you know, it's happening very, very slowly. Yesterday at an event, I saw a league table of European countries, and as the speaker said, the UK was right at the bottom in terms of numbers of heat pump installations per year, comparing us to countries like Sweden and Germany, where I think it was up by 50% last year, or something just today. They're going ahead very, very quickly. So it's not really that the technology isn't available and getting cheaper, etc. It's really that our market and our skills, our supply chain are not well developed. I don't usually tell personal anecdotes, but somebody came to service our boiler, and I was talking to my partner last night about it. Apart from having to dismantle a cupboard as usual, she was asking about heat pumps because we want to put one in our house at some point. We're going to move house, and that's one of the things we want to do. And this guy said, oh, yes, I was registered on a crane course, I haven't been yet, but don't worry, we're all going to be on hydrogen soon. We're just going to convert hydrogen. You can buy a hydrogen boiler in a couple of years from us, and it will all be fine. And so, of course, I was trying to correct some of this stuff. Clearly, he might be right in some areas, of course. I'm not saying it's entirely wrong, but it was really interesting that an installer would come, and I'm sure that's common to many people's experience, with a very, very strong kind of view. This is the way it's going to happen. I don't bother with this electricity heat pump stuff. Not in Brighton, where we happen to live. So there you go. That's my anecdote to add to the pile you might hear from all. Couple of areas just to cover before I bring things to a close. Industry, I think in all countries is a real challenge. As I've shown, we've got some reductions, but there's a lot of work to do in terms of some of the technology options are kind of known, you know, how to make low carbon steel, low carbon cement, etc. Move to electricity or carbon capture and storage, but we're a long way from actually implementing those. I think a particular challenge the UK shares with many other countries that in some areas, and that's why I put this map here, we've got clusters of industries where you could think about developing a hydrogen grid or carbon capture and storage network to take the carbon out of processes. And here are some of the clusters that we have in the UK in different areas. But actually about half of the industrial emissions are in what's called dispersed sites. They're in areas where they're not all concentrated in one place. They're smaller, much more difficult. And I feel that government have a much less well-developed strategy for these dispersed sites, which really would require engaging things like local authorities, local governments, and things like that, than it does for some of these big clusters in places like Teesside in North East England. So I think that's a particular challenge. I think government's done okay on this, but clearly we're still a long way from implementation, and that really needs to be done. Transport, so this is from Christian Brandt, who works here at the ECI. It's one of the best transport modelers. I'm not just saying that because I'm standing here in Oxford. But, you know, since I was involved in this analysis with him in 2019, 2018, this is basically modelling the trajectory of cars and vans emissions in the UK, depending on different levels of regulation. So the regulation we have now is closest to the green line, which you can see there. And what he was trying to illustrate with his modelling was that if you really want to get to 80%, 95%, or even lower emissions reduction, banning eventually petrol and diesel cars and vans is going to help a lot. It's going to bring down those emissions rapidly and grow markets for alternatives. But actually, LS on the chart is lifestyle change. So other measures to reduce demand, switching to public transport, using cars less. Demand reduction is required alongside. I spoke to somebody yesterday who's doing a lot of work with Department of Transport, and she said, you've seen here in UKRI, I won't tell you who it is, but she said basically I cannot talk about demand reduction in the Department of Transport. They said, no, we can't talk about it. It's just off the agenda. So there's a really interesting cultural reaction to that being even part of the picture. So finally, on a couple of things, I just wanted to spend a few words before I draw this to a close. So I know we need to leave some time for discussion and questions. Is that as we move to net zero, earlier I talked a little bit about managing the security of fossil fuels. You know, the idea of diversity, the Winston Churchill idea, etc. How we diversify away from Russia for other countries, not the UK necessarily, but really think about that diversity and resilience. We also have to think about what's coming next. What are the new security challenges as we move to net zero? And there's a number of these I've just picked out in the last few slides, which I'll cover briefly. So the International Energy Agency talks about this quite a lot, and this is, of course, for them, a global analysis. So these are common challenges for many, many countries. One is that if we're successful in reaching net zero, a lot less oil and a lot less gas is going to be used. And for some countries or big oil and gas producers, that means a massive fall in demand. It might mean big changes to their economy. It might mean huge loss of revenue for their government budgets and huge social challenges as well. So, you know, part of the IEA flagging this is to say, well, please start getting ready for this big change which may be coming down the track. Second chart, critical minerals demand. I've mentioned it in passing, but the shift to low carbon technologies means the demand for cobalt for batteries, lithium for batteries, other more rare earth metals is already increasing and is going to increase over time. Doesn't mean to say we're going to run out. We never run out of fossil fuels necessarily, but it will lead to new challenges about where those are produced. Are we concentrating production in countries that maybe we don't have the best relations with? Are there more issues with potential trade disruptions? And then more and more renewable generation. That's going to be a challenge for electricity grid operators. More weather dependent renewables. Doesn't mean to say again they can't meet the challenge. It's something that those grid companies are going to have to do. I've included a bit of data on some of these things just for a bit more detail. So BP Statistical Review of Energy, if you read it, it's famous for having lots of data on oil, gas, coal and renewables. Now it publishes data on where the reserves of some of these rare materials are, where they are shared, which I think is quite interesting. So in lithium reserves, there's a real concentration in China, but sorry, in Chile, that is 45%. Big concentration there. For cobalt, it's the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, which there's a lot of discussion and, of course, impacts there in terms of labour issues, use of child labour, environmental impacts, and so on. Lots of that finds its way into electric vehicle batteries. So certainly some of these new materials throw up not just issues of resources, but other issues too. There's also issues of supply routes. So this really caught my eye. This is a plan. It was announced over a year ago now, but I think it's still live, this project. So this idea of getting Morocco to produce loads and loads of solar energy, and they're building a very big cable from Morocco to the UK to supply that solar energy to the UK market. These investors have been into government probably many, many times, saying we would like a subsidy contract to do this. But if you've got a very, very big cable that becomes a big part of your mix, clearly from a security perspective, if I were the military or somebody else in government, I'd be thinking, well, that makes it quite a vulnerable supply line. So we better make sure that if that something happens, whether it's accident, whether it's technical, or whether it's malevolent, we've got enough other redundancy to take care of it. So interconnection, don't get me wrong, is a really good thing because it means we share security with neighbours and so on. But we also need to think about the implications. I want to talk about this one. This is the UK version of the balancing electricity systems. Just a word on storage. Historically, energy systems had a lot of storage. So this chart from the Scottish Government on the left-hand side just shows you the size of energy storage. I think it's about 5 years old in the UK. So we used to have a lot of storage in red in the coal stocks. So piles of coal at places like Didcot near here. You won't see that now, of course. Crude oil stocks in tanks, natural gas stocks in storage reservoirs. You've got petrol in vehicles. You've got storage at petrol stations. Energy storage all over the place. Now you hear more about energy storage, but it's about electricity storage. And I showed you through the graph on the right, electricity storage is growing very, very fast in the UK and many other countries. So the investment is growing very rapidly. The point I want to make is the size of electricity storage, if you add it all up, is tiny compared to the storage we used to have in fossil fuels. Not to say it has to be the same size, but the job it's doing is very, very different. So it can really help balance our grid in the short term, but we do need more large-scale storage, which helps between, say, summer and winter. So we're going to generate a lot of solar electricity, store it in some way, and then use it for heating. So finally, bring it all together. Is the government getting it right? Well, you've already heard my answer. I think the security strategy that came out in April, which is the UK's response to the invasion of Ukraine, it was one-sided. I think I've demonstrated that, hopefully. Real focus on long-term and on supply. Some of the ideas in it and the priorities in it were good, but it wasn't really balanced by that demand side and the shorter term. And then big question marks about the fossil fuel investment. Whether you agree with it or not, is it really going to help us with our security, either in the short term or the medium term? Energy demand is getting a bit more attention. That target is really eye-catching. We meet it. There's a bit more money, but this idea that the MPs came up with a sort of war effort, I think there's still a long way from that. Oil and transport are largely absent. We're still not thinking about it from a security perspective, the way that many other countries are, and some of the measures that they came up with. The impression that new oil and gas licensing is really going to help us, it won't make a significant difference. It's going to take time and really impact on our supplies and our imports are going to be, there will be an impact, but it'll be relatively small. And then I think there's not enough focus on that resilience. How do we make a system that's more robust to the next round of shocks? Some of them we won't be able to predict. So nobody predicted that Russia would invade Ukraine. I was involved in some exercises a few years ago in the government. We sort of war gamed a number of things that could happen to gas supplies. I don't think we had an invasion of Ukraine on our list. We might have had an explosion at an oil terminal. So you can have an equivalent of that in the future. But really, it's making sure that whatever happens, we've got a resilient system to deal with some issue. I'll leave it there and look forward to the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, David. In a lot there because that's the whole of the energy policy space. Prerogative of my position. I'm just going to ask you a question. Talk a little bit about targets. So the extent to which targets are useful in the task force, for example. I remember 20 gigawatts of solar by 2020, nice ring to that. So on a 30% demand reduction by 2030, we've already seen some reduction in demand associated with high energy prices. There's technology interventions you could bring forward. So what would you say the role could be of just having more obvious targets that people are working towards?
Yeah, so I think targets are useful. And if you talk to business people, I think if they, targets are durable as well, which is important, then that's an important thing. But I think they work even better if they're then backed up by a set of mechanisms, a set of incentives, whether you're talking contracts to help people invest in offshore wind or incentives to adopt electric vehicles. Clearly, sometimes targets become regulations, and that's what we've got in the vehicle. 2030 phase out of petrol and diesel vehicles and then hybrids by 2035. So I think they're better there. So I think targets are important, but if it's a target alone, I think you're not going to have the same impact mechanism.
Targets with teeth or targets with regulations?
That's it, yeah, in done. And good lessons from some of the things we've done well. They're starting to have an impact, but often it's regulation or strong incentives as well. So.
I know some people have to leave promptly, but can I open the floor to some questions, please? Brenda hasn't got a hand up yet. That's right, yeah.
Opening with the difficult one, but on the market reform stuff, how much wiggle room, which used to take 3 or 4 years, but how much wiggle room is there? Is the whole marginal price of gas affecting the whole thing just how markets work, or is there something that can be done? Like, are you talking turning a kind of market on its head and just buying the whole system out, or is there any? Yeah, what could be done in this space?
Yeah, that is a good question, because when it was first being discussed, there was almost a dual track approach being suggested. The first track could happen more quickly. So this was the idea, and again, it's a live debate in the European Union as well, of basically saying, well, for some renewables which were invested in a long time ago, the generators are making windfall profits because the electricity prices are very high. They're generating very low. They had either subsidies or they paid off their capital a long time ago. So you could actually do an auction to get them to reset contracts, and then the benefits get fed through to consumers quickly. You could have done that. The government's chosen actually to put a tax on companies rather than individual projects and contracts. So it's indirectly the same thing, but I'm less sure whether that's going to deliver quick benefits, because clearly that's revenue that goes into the UK Finance Ministry and they decide how they're going to spend it, which might not be on that particular consumer. The longer term, yes, it is going to take 3 or 4 years because it's a rewiring of the market. So basically my colleague's idea is, Michael Grubb's idea, basically to split the market. So you have what's called a green power pool. All the renewable goes into a pool. It's cheap. You can get, you can write contracts with industry, whether they do it themselves or there's some sort of oversight. And then there's a separate sort of market to balance the rest of the system, to generate the rest of the electricity you need to balance the system. And they're basically, I haven't get on top of all the detail, but they're basically going through the process of working through exactly. And
I just ask, you touched on the problem that's no hypothecation of these taxes. When we originally introduced some idea that industry should decarbonise, the idea was that people paying fines should go into a fund that helps make that happen. So is there a case for actually creating a fund to deliver some of the progress funded directly from this tax?
I think there is, especially if you look at the windfall tax and energy efficiency. I showed you the numbers, but given that the UK Treasury is either borrowing or spending our taxes every year at the moment to a great extent on supporting bills on consumer subsidy, it would make sense to recycle some of that revenue into helping to reduce demand and hence the amount of support they're going to have to provide, next winter or the winter afterwards. So I think you can make a direct connection, and it's almost in government's own interest to do it. But obviously not obviously, but there is always a resistance from government, because governments want to retain maximum flexibility. So generally, certainly our finance ministry, the Treasury, hates hypothecation as a principle. They do it occasionally, but they don't really like it.
Robin, can I just follow up with that last question? Jim, I'm still on the green power pool question. The cost of supporting households is so phenomenally high. Surely there's a lot of pressure on the government to do something, and the contracts for difference already exist.
Yeah.
Why can't they bring it in quicker?
Yeah, I mean, they could have brought that in a bit more quickly. I mean, it's partly inertia, and obviously partly chaos as well, in that you've gone through 3 governments, and every time the same party, but a new set of people take over, they've done a review and revised their plans. But I agree, I sort of expected this first leg of reform to be brought in more quickly to try and fix the problem, but that just seems to have melted away to some extent. And we've got, instead, government has plunged this what they call the electricity generator levy, which I showed on the slide there, rather than something which was gaining momentum. In fact, my successor at UK Energy Research Centre proposed it, I think, at the time of a pot zero auction, of auctioning older renewables which have paid off their capital and then be able to, basically reset their contracts so they're generating and they're earning a lot less. They're still earning a return, but maybe a more sensible return. And the difference is helping consumers. That seems to have been abandoned in favour of this idea of a general tax on companies, which, of course, companies aren't very happy.
Great. Next question.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for a very nice talk and a very good summary, and on which I agree with many of your comments. But your question up there is the UK government getting it right. Now, that's all right, getting it right for the UK.
Yes.
What's it doing about the rest of the world, which will screw all of them activities if they don't actually make some contribution there. And one's had, of course, the taking money out of the ODA and things like. So again, where is that going to get fed into if, particularly the younger people in this audience, will be living in a climate that's dominated by other people when we've done the good thing?
Yes, we have to be fair to Jim that we only asked him to talk about it. We did expand it.
But I do work for a Foreign Office funded program, so I've got direct experience of the point about, you know, the cuts in ODA, you know, telling people about it over a drink sometime, but you know, it's not been a great time to be working on Foreign Office or Development Ministry funded research or programs because the budget cuts have been really big.
But I think what I'm trying to make is the point is that doing all this stuff is good, but it's no good unless they've all done it as well.
Yes.
So therefore, you've got to have a self-interest in making sure it works elsewhere.
Yeah. So I'll give a sort of part positive, part negative answer to this. I think on the positive side, the UK moving early on the net zero target, I think, you know, and particularly around to COP26, I think it did help to get other countries on side and working with coalitions of willing countries on specific areas such as transport. The Powering Past Coal Alliance, which of course rang a little hollow when they approved the new coal line last year, which was a real disaster, I think, for the public relations disaster, if nothing else. So there's areas that they've done well. There are other areas where UK technology leadership has really helped. So the offshore wind example is a good one, and probably along with other countries helping to drive that shift to electric vehicles by having stringent targets. On the downside, you've got the contortions about new oil and gas licensing. As I've shown you, in principle, it's compatible with our carbon budget, but from an international point of view, it's basically saying we will develop more, so therefore somebody else somewhere else is going to have to dig less gas and oil out of the ground. Because if you look at what the IEA says, it says ideally you don't have any more oil and gas development. And then there's the cuts in the aid budget, etc., which means that basically the UK is doing a lot less of that soft diplomacy, that support for low-income countries in particular, to help develop, you know, solutions which are both going to help them with energy access and poverty, but also hopefully be compatible with a climate resilient future as well. I mean, we're doing quite a lot of that, but I think had the cuts not happened, the UK would be supporting a lot more of that sort of stuff.
Can I just pick up one online question, please? We know that the can has been kicked down the road a little bit about repurposing the gas grid in inverted commas. So one of the questions is around decarbonisation and the use of gas boilers in the future with that, but more generally, whether our ability to focus on the heat pump deployment has really been affected by the crises we've seen in electricity prices in particular. So thanks to Jake and Richard for those questions.
Yeah, I think that is important, and certainly, I mean, from one point of view, of course, electricity prices have been very high, as have gas prices. So for some people, the shift to the heat pump makes sense if it's done in combination with, you know, fabric measures. You know, a number of people, I'm sure many of you will know people who've gone the whole hog and upgraded their home and are quite happy to do that in most cases. So, but you're right, there is still, I didn't put in a slide about this, but there's still quite a big battle out there, and it's often in rhetorical terms between those who really believe that hydrogen is the answer and those who believe electricity, rather than saying, well, on a local basis, maybe there are some areas where hydrogen might make sense if you're close to an industrial area like Teesside, possibly. But I think the thing I'd say on hydrogen is until we've got like trials on how we converted an area of the gas grid to hydrogen, got it into people's homes, we really understand all the technical, economic and other challenges. And I think it's quite hard to kind of make a very definitive statement on that. I noticed from the government's most recent announcement, I think from November, they really want to press ahead with what they call their hydrogen village. So that's their first step in scaling up hydrogen. And if they do that, and I'm all for trials, we can then perhaps learn a bit more about that. But in the meantime, we ought to be encouraging heat pumps because that's tried and tested and known.
We don't have quite the same gas boiler ban as we do for internal combustion engines.
No,
there's an element of it, but it's not.
No, and I think we could do that, and that's something interesting that Chris Skidmore, the MP who published last Friday, did talk about, and was pulled up on, I think, in media interviews. But I think you could do that. You could say, well, you know, by the time you get to whatever it is, the mid-2030s, if your boiler breaks down, we'll provide some help for low-income houses, but you have to shift to something else. You know, it's not that we're going to take your boiler away, which is probably some of the media headline writers assumed what he meant in 2035, because clearly if it works, you wait till it breaks down and is aging. But
We can imagine which newspapers you have.
yeah, well, yeah, no, because
I'll take a question from the back, so I will come back to you. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I had a question about decarbonisation and the role of CCS in UK government energy policy. So, like recent IPCC reports say we've got an 80% chance of missing the 1.5 degree target. So, a couple of professors in the ECI have been very intent that carbon capture and storage is the right way. And I'm wondering what your impression is and like what the appetite is within the UK government for CCS, and kind of given current energy prices, like what the appetite is within industry for something like CCS.
yeah, I think appetite is quite strong. I guess you're referring to Miles Allen. Miles for a long time. And I've worked on CCS for a lot. It's a bit mixed on that one. I mean, in some ways, the government is as committed now as it's ever been, although governments have been committed to CCS in various guises for about 10 years. We haven't built any plants yet. You know, so that's what makes you more pessimistic, is that although money has been put on the table several times, projects have been developed, actually they've not been deployed at scale, unlike in some other countries. But I think you're absolutely right. Many of the projections, whether you're thinking international or the UK, there's a big chunk of CCS, either in the guise of helping to take away emissions from fossil fuel use, or as part of the negative emissions needed to balance agriculture and flying, for example. So I think it's probably going to be necessary to some extent, less than perhaps in electricity, but more in industry and some other areas. But there's still real question marks about whether everything's in place. But I think the government now, over the last couple of years, has done a lot more detailed work, started to think about contractual structures. How are you going to persuade a company who has a steel plant to actually invest in the capture? How are you going to persuade pipeline companies to invest in those and storage development? I hope we start to see it, partly because, you know, more of it is needed, but I still think we shouldn't rely on it. The less we use it, the better. So, yeah, as you're probably hearing, I've got fairly mixed views about it.
So you don't see the government legislating for EAC or like any hints in the government that that might be a possibility?
Not at the moment, no. I think the approach they've taken is it's important. We've got the industrial cluster that's very much linked to that. And here's some contracts, a bit like the ones we have for low carbon electricity, which we could use for CCS and for hydrogen, actually. So I haven't kept up to that for a few months, but that's the direction we're going. But not legislating the way some suggested, to say if you're a fossil fuel producer, you should have that kind of obligation to bury all the emissions from all of the stuff you can. I can't imagine them going.
Just come down to the front right. Thank you.
Great, so thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the energy storage and what you thought a kind of plausible scenario might be, especially after kind of electrification of other sectors, like transport or heating, the amount of electricity demand that there might be, given that we can only dam so many kind of valleys. You know, what would a plausible scheme look like in 2050 in the UK?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the first thing is that, you know, as I showed you very briefly, the battery storage is growing very fast. And the last figures I saw, it's at least 1.5 gigawatts of storage, which is the equivalent of a large power station. I mean, it won't generate electricity for very long, but at least that capacity is there. I think the pipeline is something like 20 gigawatts. So there's a lot of companies wanting to invest in battery storage. But as I said, that's only going to help with certain types of balancing supply and demand over shorter timescales. When you get to longer ones, I think you're right. There aren't that many sites left where you might build, you know, big reservoirs or things like pump storage, which we've had in the UK, a couple of examples. So then you're thinking about using surplus renewables to make hydrogen and storing that somewhere, maybe compressed air in salt caverns, those kinds of things to be done. But certainly, I think we will need probably some form of longer term storage. And that may be, you know, where hydrogen does come in. It's as much a storage medium as it is an energy carrier that's going to actually supply energy for particular uses. I'm not a huge expert in this area, but I think the one thing from talking to people I know is that, you know, just relying on the batteries, it's great and it will do lots for us, but it's not going to do everything that we're going to need. And certainly the size of the grid is going to get bigger. You know, maybe 2 times bigger, maybe 3 times, depending on how efficient we are with the use of energy.
Probably means we should invite Chris Llewellyn-Smith back from our own parish, because he was undertaking a Royal Society study on large storage. He didn't say long duration, just said large. I think it's the scale. So we'll find out where he's got to with that. I think let's go to the gentleman at the back. Would you mind speaking up? Is that possible?
Yeah, thanks a lot for talking. Very interesting that you mentioned the lack of a focus on transports in the strategies. I want to hear your thoughts on, so in France, they introduced the legislation that if there are train routes that can replace kind of domestic flights, I think in less than 2.5 hours or so, they're banning the flights. And in the UK, I think that there was a recent report last year from the Intergenerational Foundation that found that you could have 50% reduction in emissions from domestic aviation if 10 flying routes were just kind of refocused towards rail where there's existing transport infrastructure. So kind of your thoughts on that type of legislation and what role rail, and especially high-speed rail, with all the kind of controversies related to HS1, would play in a future net zero scenario.
So I really like the French idea. You obviously have to have a rail network that works in order to implement it, and we don't have one of those. And you need to have something which is affordable. Many people, we don't have one of those either. So I think it has to be part of a strategy that not only discourages domestic flights. I mean, we're not a very big island. Some, you know, there is obviously pressure for people who have to fly. So in Northern Ireland, Scottish people who live in Scottish islands, etc. It was very interesting. I looked after this area for the Climate Assembly, and that was some of the concerns that were raised. But again, the Assembly overall were fairly sympathetic to the idea that certainly if we had better rail links, then we could go in that direction. I think the other big caveat is that most UK emissions from flying are from flying internationally, the vast majority. So then you might want to extend, perhaps in conjunction with our European neighbours, who are going to cooperate again, which would be nice, to say, well, actually not just flying within the UK, but actually, you know, within a certain radius, you know, you can get Eurostar and places in a few hours, then perhaps. Certainly a lot of organisations, my own included, UCL, really discourages us from flying now to Brussels or Paris and a few cities beyond. So I think seeing it on a continent-wide basis as well.
I think if it's in the same place, if it's a shorter trip, then you should be taking the train.
Yeah.
And even after that, there has to be some sort of kind of tax associated with carbon emissions, which we know isn't proportionate, but at least recognise it. So I'm going to wrap this up soon, but I can see a lady over there with a question behind me.
I think the gentleman
Nick, okay.
here for me. So I'm happy to refer. Would you like to ask?
That's a very quick one. You didn't mention carbon pricing as a policy. Do you feel that has an important role?
It has had and does, yes, as an underpinning policy. It's been very important in the kind of squeezing coal out of the electricity system, for example. That was happening more rapidly because we had that, not just a carbon price, but a floor price. So that has been important. But in general, I feel it's sort of necessary, gives that signal. And clearly, if it's high enough, durable enough, people will invest against it. But what's really made a difference as well is the more specific policies that are sector specific. So they're sort of proxies for a carbon price, but expressed in a different form. So they're a contract for solar, or they're a driver to help you, encourage you to adopt an electric vehicle, or whatever. So I think carbon pricing in a pure form works really well in the textbook. In practice, it's great, but it's necessary but not sufficient, would be my view. If there was a proper economist rather than myself in the room, they might have an argument with me about that, but that's mine.
Oh, they don't like coming in the same room as us, so maybe we'll...
So the challenge first, and then a question. The challenge is on gas security of supply. So the graph from Financial Times is really helpful, but it doesn't really show numbers. So for instance, Bulgaria was like 100% dependent on Russia, but they're just using 2 or 3 BCM of gas, and that can easily be supplied by Turkey or Romania, which is happening now. So the dependence is not as high as that graph shows. It's a famous graph. I used to have it in my presentations like 10 years ago. So that's why I know it. But the point why this matters is because in 2014 and even before that, all of Eastern Europe did point out that Russia is going to attack Ukraine. And clearly that point never landed with the UK government, because the UK government thought, well, they're just being worried because they're so dependent on Russian gas, without acknowledging the nuance of that dependence can be fixed. This is a real problem that Russia will attack Ukraine regardless of the gas supply problem. So that's kind of the point I wanted to make, just because it used to be my bread and butter years ago, so I didn't want that to go miss. A question on the green pool for contract. So would that have any legal implications? I don't know if this is covered in the UCL paper, maybe it is, but aren't the contract signed, like the support that all those renewable generators are getting, those are commercial contracts that have been put in place. If now those are scrapped, is that not illegal? Is government not going to be legally challenged by those companies?
No,
I just wonder if that's one of the reasons why government hasn't done anything quicker about that.
That's absolutely true. There would be a transitional arrangement. Clearly, there'd have to be an agreement to swap one contract for another. So I don't think there's any implication that somebody starts having contracts. Because one of the real advantages of the system we've had, renewables auctions, and it's the same in a number of other countries as well, is that they are private contracts. So in other words, I remember hearing that George Osborne, one of our former finance ministers, wanted to tear up some of these contracts, and he was told he couldn't, because it wasn't the government that was, the counterparty of the private contracts, so we had to leave them alone. Because of that, then the takeoff in offshore wind was protected in the UK, rather than being stymied by what he might have done at the time. So I was told that reliably by somebody who certainly government with it. So yes, I'd probably say encourage you to read the paper, because I'm probably not fully on top of what they're saying, but I haven't heard my colleagues say we start to with contracts. But thank you also for the point on Bulgaria, and also that general regional view of Ukraine and Russia. So one thing I tend to do every year is I give a lecture to, and then I have the most difficult questions I ever face. No offense to you guys, from a group of army officers and diplomats from around the world. So I teach at the Royal College of Defence Studies. They always have a set of people from places like Bulgaria, from Ukraine, etc. For many years, they were making exactly that point to me. But that's the only forum where I heard it. When I talked to government officials, as I said, this wasn't really taken seriously. So I think there was a real problem with really understanding, and perhaps not investment in enough understanding of that region, understanding of Russia, etc. And now, of course, we're living with the consequences of the lack of preparedness through. So I really echo what you said.
So if Jim's happy, what I'm going to suggest, any other questions?
We've got one more here because he's been waiting quite a
I'll not go on. Go on.
You mentioned the grid a couple of minutes ago, and I keep hearing from various sources that this whole grand plan on heat pumps, electric vehicles, generations is going to fall over because the grid's not up to it, and the UK government isn't paying any attention. It's going to take a decade.
Yeah.
Can you comment?
Yeah, I think it depends where you are. This came up at an event I was speaking at last night as well. So some, people, particularly from rural areas, I think there is an issue. So some people have been told, oh, you can't have a car charger or whatever because the line you're on is very, very low voltage. It's already overstressed. And sorry, there's not enough network. And then it's like, well, please can you upgrade the network? Oh, it's not in the current plan, etc. So I think there really is a potential divide between rural areas on weak areas of grid and urban areas. Urban areas, in many cases, the grid is better, but it doesn't mean to say that there isn't a need for upgrading and investment. And that is being done in some cases, and clearly there are plans to do it. But then you end up in a discussion between the companies who have to do it, the regulator trying to stop consumers being taken for a ride by companies spending too much. But also this longer term vision of saying, actually, that's what we need to do. But that tension isn't new. I mean, I've been following this for a decade or more. And I think finally the industry and government got to a place where they could think a bit medium long term rather than always thinking, well, we must always think short term, which was clearly not going to solve that problem. So I wouldn't say it's not a problem, but I think it's probably going to be more of a problem in rural areas, in some urban areas too. So I think getting that right is very important, rather than forgetting about the bit in between the heat pump and the generator.
I think we also haven't looked at socialisation of the cost of the people who are able to do that now being passed on to consumers who are not part of the transition, and whether in fact the regulator is doing a good job of protecting the vulnerable customers whilst trying to do a good thing overall. I think that's another topic. So what I'm going to suggest is if Jim is willing to catch any of the final questions before he leaves, the main things to do are to say thank you very much indeed to Jim.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next week we have John Barrett coming down from University of Leeds, Pulse Creds, but he's going to be talking about that behaviour stuff, positive low energy futures. We could use less energy and it could be a better place to be. So it'll be